Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, Beniyahu the son of Yehoyadah, was one of the most fearsome warriors during the reign of King David and King Shlomo. He was an incredible Torah scholar. He was the leading sage of Dovid Hamelech's Sanhedrin, Dovid Hamelech's High Court, and a general and head of the military during the reign of King Shlomo. Before we start, here are a few questions for those who are somewhat familiar with the story of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. Number one, if Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was a Kohen, a priest, how was it that he was the official man picked to commit three of the most high-profile executions in Jewish history? He's a priest. Number two, how did Beniyahu manage to restrain Ashmedai, the king of the demons, without being hurt, even though Ashmedai still clearly had enough power to rampage and destroy all that was in his pathway on the journey back to Yerushalayim? And number three, why in the Gemara do the rabbis use the vicious one-on-one confrontation between Beniyahu and the 8-foot Egyptian warrior to demonstrate a halachic example of the behavior of a gazlan or forceful robber?
Welcome to Untold Stories of the Torah, a masterclass in Jewish history, presented by Rabbi Shmuel Aber.
Two quick notes before we begin. Number one, I would like to thank the Bressinger family for sponsoring this episode in loving memory of Dina Elka Bastzvi Hirsch. And secondly, if you're enjoying this podcast, please take a second to leave a 5-star rating on your listening platform. It really helps other people discover this podcast. Let's begin with the early life of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. I haven't found a place that describes exactly when his birth was and how old he was, different points of his life. But we know that, according to all opinions, Beniyahu was already old enough to become one of the soldiers of Dovid Hamelech in the year 2892 of the Jewish count, which is about 869 years before the Common Era, and it's a little before 40 years before the building of the first Beis Hamikdash, the first Jewish temple. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was a Kohen. He was from the tribe of Levi, and he comes from a city called Kavtzoel. Kavtzoel is mentioned earlier on in history. It was one of the southern cities of the kingdom of Yehuda, near the border of Edom, so the very, very south of Israel, and it's listed in the conquests of Yeshua in the book of Joshua. He came from that city. Beniyahu was an incredible warrior, and he was a scholar during the times of these two kings, of Dovid Hamelech and Shlomo, his son. And later on, in fact, he was so righteous, and he was such an incredible tzaddik. The Gemara in Brachos writes that he was so righteous he left no one his equal in both the entire first temple era and the entire second temple era. So we're talking about a tremendously, tremendously righteous man. His father Yehoyadah, or as the verse calls him, Yehoyadah Hanogid La'aron. He's also called Yehoyadah Ben Beniyahu. He was a Kohen Gadol, and he was from the tribe of Levi, and he was also a tremendously righteous man. In fact, the Ralbag writes that the praise that's described about Beniyahu in Shmuel Beis, in the verses, that he's a Ben Ish Chai or a Ben Ish Chayil, is actually not about Beniyahu. It's about his father Yehoyadah. His father Yehoyadah was so great that Beniyahu was called the son of an Ish Chayil. The praise Ben Ish Chayil isn't about Beniyahu, according to the Ralbag. It's actually about his father, which is very, very interesting. In Divrei Hayomim, it says that when Dovid Hamelech was gathering support in Hebron, in his early years of his reign, before he had officially become king of all the Jewish people, shortly after the passing of King Shaul, but during the reign of Shaul's son, King Ishbosheth, Yehoyadah, who was the active Kohen Gadol at the time, because Eviasa, who we'll talk about shortly, was already with Dovid Hamelech, Yehoyadah, the father of Beniyahu, joined Dovid Hamelech, and he brought along with him 3,700 Kohanim, who also became loyal to King David. So in Dovid Hamelech's very early days, Yehoyadah joins forces with Dovid Hamelech and loyalty with Dovid Hamelech, and it seems that he brought his son Beniyahu along with him. Now, just for a matter of completion, even though we're not going to follow this approach throughout the episodes, There is an opinion in the Tosfos, a rather shocking opinion in the Tosfos, especially for those that are more familiar with Navi. And the Tosfos says that, in fact, there were two Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadahs, not one. There was an elder one and a grandson, and these two Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadahs share the same name, but they were not the same person. And Tosfos resolves a few issues using that answer. The Mashah explains why Tosfos has to come with that approach. But it's an interesting approach to know about, that there's in fact two Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadahs. That being said, in this series, we're going to follow like Rashi and almost all the other commentators who learn very simply there is only one Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. He was very active during King David's reign, Dovid Hamelech's reign, and he was also very active during Shlomo Hamelech's reign, and it was all the same person. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was very loyal to Dovid Hamelech also, like his father, from the very early days of Dovid Hamelech's kingship. According to the Abarbanel, the fact that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah is listed as one of the Giborim, one of the strong warriors in Shmuel Beis, and also in Divrei Yamim, it means that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was a loyal officer, a soldier, warrior of David Hamelech from the very early days of his kingship. The fact that he's mentioned in that list means that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah had to have been loyal to David Hamelech from the very beginning of the kingship. The Ralbag says that all the officers and warriors that are listed as the warriors of Dovid Hamelech, they at least were the times of Ishbosheth, and some of them were already from the time when David was fleeing from Shaul Hamelech, when he was running away from his life. So Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah either joined Dovid Hamelech in the very early days of his reign, or it could have been he joined Dovid Hamelech already during the times of Shaul. Now, there's a massive conversation whether Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah served in the capacity of a Kohen Gadol as well. The details of the discussion are far beyond the scope of this episode, but it is interesting to note that there are some people that say Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah wasn't just a Kohen, but like his father, he also served in the capacity as a high priest, as a Kohen Gadol. There is a very fascinating and very important story that's very much unknown, and it concerns the early days of both Dovid Hamelech and Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. The story is recorded in Shmuel Beis, but it's only mentioned in a few verses, and most people glide right over it. And it's a story about three brave warriors described as the three who drew water for Dovid Hamelech. Most of the commentators don't mention who the three people are. It's left vague in the verses, and they leave it alone. And even from the Gemara, it might seem that there's good reason why the commentators don't actually quote who it is. And therefore, the Targum Yonasan and Rashi and the Radak and the Matsudas and the Malbim, they don't actually mention the names of who the three people who drew the water were. But the Abarbanel does. And the Abarbanel lists one of the people who drew water as Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. So because it's the Abarbanel who tells us that it's Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah who's in the story, we're going to say the story based on the way that the Abarbanel learns the story. That being said, it is important to mention that there are many opinions of how to understand the story, and we're just going to follow mainly the Abarbanel's opinion. According to the Abarbanel and the Malbim, the story of the drawing of the water happened soon after Dovid Hamelech became the king over all the Jewish people. So this is 7 years after he was appointed by his tribe, Yehuda, in Hebron, after the assassination of King Ishbosheth, the son of King Shaul. The Radak learns it happened many, many years earlier. But the Abarbanel rejects this view very emphatically. And the Abarbanel also learns that this story is directly connected to the Dovid Hamelech's battle in Emek Rephaim. So let's begin. During the life of King Shaul, David pretended to have a good relationship with the Plishtim. In fact, he even was close with the king of the Plishtim. He lived in Plishti land, and they assumed that he was an ally. They hated King Shaul, and they assumed that King Shaul was the enemy. But once Dovid Hamelech officially became king of all the Jewish people, the Abarbanel says that the Plishtim heard about his coronation, and they spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Dovid Hamelech was in an area called Mitzuda at the time. He was cut off by the enemy Plishti troops. And the Plishti troops had also garrisoned themselves in Dovid Hamelech's hometown in Beis Lechem. This is where Dovid Hamelech had grown up. As we mentioned in the previous series of Dovid Hamelech's ancestor, Boaz and Rus, their family lived in Beis Lechem. The Plishti enemy garrisoned one of their armies in Beis Lechem, and Dovid Hamelech was cut off. And the Plishtim, meanwhile, were in Emek Rephaim, a valley, the valley of Rephaim, and they were attacking the farmers. The Abarbanel explains that the Plishtim began approaching the fields in Emek Rephaim, destroying as much crop as they could. It was the early days of the harvest, and they wanted to starve the Jewish people out. This is what the Plishtim would do to the enemies. They would try their best to destroy the crops to create a famine. So Dovid Hamelech went out with his army to confront them and save the produce. It was harvest time, or early harvest time, and the Jewish people greatly feared the Plishtim, and they were especially worried that the Plishtim would take some of them hostages while they were working in their field. Therefore, Dovid Hamelech came to protect and to rescue them. The Malbim explains that Dovid Hamelech saw the Plishtim raiding their farms, and together with 3 of his mightiest warriors, descended upon the pillaging Plishtim without any assistance. The rest of the army that were there, besides Dovid Hamelech, they saw the Plishtim, they saw the Philistines, and they all ran away. And Dovid Hamelech and his 3 mightiest men went down to the fields on their own, even though their men deserted them. Dovid Hamelech's 3 mightiest men were Adinoi Ha'etzni, who was the strongest of Dovid Hamelech's men, and later to be listed as the leader amongst the 3 warrior bodyguards of Dovid Hamelech. In his first moments of his battle, he killed 800 men before taking a break and then continuing to fight. Elazar ben Doidoi entered a field filled with barley and began killing all the Plishtim. And he killed all the Plishtim until not a single one was left. And he continued to fight until his arm became tired to such a degree that it was stuck to his sword. He couldn't remove his hands, his grip from his sword. And the Bible says his sword got stuck to his hand because there was so much blood from the people that he killed that it stuck his hand to his sword. Shammah ben Agay also went to a field, and he was the 3rd of Dovid Hamelech's mightiest warriors who fought alongside David in this war, in this battle. He went into a field of lentils, and he attacked the Plishtim who were trying to destroy it, and he stood his ground in the middle of the field and defended from the hordes of the Plishti attackers. The verse says Hashem made a massive miracle through David and his 3 men, and by the time the reinforcements arrived, the Jewish people had no one else to kill. Dovid Hamelech and his 3 men went to battle on their own and killed absolutely everyone, and the only thing that the Jewish people who finally arrived what they could do was just strip the enemy. There was no battle left to be had. After this battle, while Dovid Hamelech was in that area, Dovid Hamelech mused aloud to his men. He was talking aloud, and he said, "If only I could drink of the water of the well that's by the gate of Beis Lechem." The Radak actually says that Dovid Hamelech actually was hoping that one of his men would go. The Abarbanel outright rejects this and says, no, Dovid Hamelech was musing. Dovid Hamelech grew up in Beis Lechem, and there's a certain sweetness of the water of your hometown. And so Dovid Hamelech he was musing aloud. It'd be so wonderful to have this water. He never imagined or even wanted any of his men to go and draw the water. He was just talking aloud, and it'd be so wonderful to have this water. But he knew it was impossible. There was an army between where they were and Beis Lechem of Plishtim, and in Beis Lechem itself there was an army that was garrisoned of the Plishtim. He knew it was impossible, but he just mused aloud, how wonderful would it be? It was almost lighthearted and joking. The Bible says it was summertime, and David was musing in a lighthearted and joking way, who will grant me as in former days when I would drink water from the wells of Beis Lechem? What happened was his men overheard him. And without his knowledge, according to the Parabana, without the knowledge of Dovid Hamelech, but in order to fulfill his wish, 3 of Dovid Hamelech's warriors broke through the camp to go get the water. According to the Parabana, the 3 men were Avishai ben Tzeruiah, who's going to come up later in this series, the nephew of Dovid Hamelech. Tzeruiah was the sister of Dovid Hamelech, and Tzeruiah had 3 warrior sons who all served Dovid Hamelech very loyally. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was the second of the 3 men that went. And there's a 3rd unnamed warrior who the Abarbanel says perhaps it was Shimi ben Gera, or Adina ben Shiza Haruveni, or perhaps Yoav. These 3 men heard Dovid Hamelech's request, and they broke through the entire Plishti camp that was blocking between them where they were camped and Beis Lechem. And they went from beginning to end of the Plishti camp, killing as they made their way through the entire camp until they made their way past it. No one was able to stop them. And they didn't go in disguise. They did it with tremendous bravery, fighting all the way along there. In fact, the verse says, these three men broke through the lines of the Plishti camp. No help, no assistance. 3 men through the entire camp of the Plishtim. They reached Beis Lechem, and they went to the well. And there was an army garrison there. They had enough strength to draw and bring out water from the well. And the Barbanel marvels the enemy weren't able to kill them, even as they were busy drawing water from the well. The Gemara in Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin says, why was there needed to be 3 men? And Bar Kapara says that one of the warriors, once they got the water, as I understand it, one of the warriors would kill the Plishti enemy, the second warrior would move the dead Plishtim out of the way, and the third warrior was able to carry the water and still remain ritually pure, tahor. On the way back, they brought the water openly and triumphantly to Dovid Hamelech. And one would expect that after fighting the enemy, when on their return, they would have spilled the water. Yet despite all the fighting that they didn't spill any of the water. And this is actually the meaning of the verse. It says, "Vayish'avu mayim mibe'er beis lechem, asher b'sha'ar, vayisu v'yavoyu el David." They drew water from the well in Beis Lechem, in the city gate, and they carried it and brought it to David. They didn't drop anything. They brought everything. Now, when Dovid Hamelech saw the water, Dovid Hamelech was shocked. And Dovid Hamelech actually refused to drink it. Dovid Hamelech said, God forbid that I should do this. Can I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives? The Bible explains that Dovid Hamelech felt that the risk that the men took in order to get the water should be equal to the goal and accomplishment carried out by them. Dovid Hamelech felt that the drinking the water was so trivial a purpose compared to the self-sacrifice that these men had to bring him that water. Therefore, Dovid Hamelech, according to the Barbanel, felt that the only fitting use for this water would be to pour it out to Hashem. Dovid Hamelech did not want to enjoy from this water. He said, I only want to pour it out to Hashem. The Yerushalmi and the Radak say that it was Sukkot time at that time. And because the Beis HaMikdash wasn't yet built, Dovid Hamelech built a mizbech where he was, near the area of the battle, and Dovid Hamelech poured the water out as a water libation, as Nisuch Hamayim to Hashem. Dovid Hamelech felt that was only fitting benefit to have from this water. The Barbanel actually writes that Dovid Hamelech didn't pour the water out at this time. Dovid Hamelech saved the water for later to pour it out. The Barbanel also brings down the Gemara in Bava Kama, a very famous Gemara in Bava Kama, a little complex Gemara in Bava Kama as well. And although the Barbanel is much more comfortable with a simple explanation of the verse, the Barbanel does quote the Gemara. The Gemara in Bava Kama says these 3 men breaking through the Plishti camp, through the Plishti enemy, in order to get water from Beis Lechem, isn't just in order to get water, but rather water is a euphemism of Torah. They wanted to ask a Torah question from the scholars, the elders of Beis Lechem, on behalf of Dovid Hamelech. The gate is a reference, as we saw in the story of Rus, the gate is a reference to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were in Beis Lechem, Dovid Hamelech had a Torah question, and these 3 men decided, despite the risks, they were going to go and ask Dovid Hamelech's question in the city of Beis Lechem to the elders of the city. They still put themselves in tremendous harm. They killed their way through the entire enemy and then went to a city that was garrisoned by the enemy as well, but their purpose wasn't physical water, but rather spiritual water. And the Torah question that Dovid Hamelech wanted to know is a matter of dispute in the Gemara in Bava Kama. Many different opinions about what Dovid Hamelech's question was and how it fits into the verses in both Shmuel Beis and in Divrei Hayamim. But according to all the opinions in the Gemara, Dovid Hamelech's question was, because he was a king, is he held by the same requirements as a regular citizen when it comes to thievery? When it comes to touching people's belongings without permission, as a king, is he allowed to infringe on other people's property, or is he not allowed to? That was the general gist of most of the opinions of his question. And they brought that question, these 3 men, including, according to the Barbanel, the Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, they brought this question to the elders. And the elders' response to Dovid Hamelech was, because he's a king, he can break down fences, he's allowed to harm other people's property because he's a king. He has to pay back, but he's allowed to harm them. When Dovid Hamelech got the answer, and he realized his men had endangered themselves so greatly to bring that answer to him, Dovid Hamelech says, I'm going to pour this water to Hashem. I'm going to behave like a regular citizen, and I'm not going to use this information that the elders gave me to help myself. And therefore, I'm going to behave like a regular citizen and not be able to utilize my power as a king, which is in fact what Dovid Hamelech did. The next time that Beniyahu is mentioned is earlier on in the kingship of Dovid Hamelech, and it's actually the appointment of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah to a very high position. Dovid Hamelech appointed Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah as the commander of the Kreisi and the Pleisi. The Targum Yonasan translates Kreisi or Pleisi as Al-Kashosaya Al-Kaloyaya, which means Beniyahu was placed in charge of the archers and the sling shooters. It was a ranged unit of Dovid Hamelech, and Beniyahu was in charge of this entire unit. The Gemara in Brachas and in Sanhedrin explain that the Kreisi and the Pleisi isn't just a reference to archers and sling shooters, but rather it's a reference to the Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jewish people. And when it says that Dovid Hamelech appointed Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah as the head, it actually means that he was placed as the Av Beis Din. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was a tremendous scholar. And Dovid Hamelech recognized that, and he told him, I want you to be in charge of the entire Beis Din, which is the most senior position in the high court after the Nasi. The Nasi is the official leader of the high court. The most senior elder is called the Av Beis Din. What's interesting is this position had been earlier held by Yehonasan, Dovid Hamelech's best friend and brother-in-law and son of King Shaul, had held this position of Beis Din. And you can listen to the 3-part series of Yehonasan to learn more about the story. But now Dovid Hamelech gives that position to Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah to officially be the Av Beis Din, to be in charge of the courts. Why was the court called the Kreisi and the Pleisi? The Gemara in 2 different places gives the answer. It says, Kreisi comes from Kreisim, decisive. When this court gave their pronouncements, they were so decisive that they got this title. And why Pleisi? Because their actions were so wondrous, mufla'im, therefore they were called the Kreisi and the Pleisi. This high court has a special title. The Radak says that the Kreisi and the Pleisi were 2 families. They were ministers of the king. They were always in front of the king. And Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was the head of this group of 2 families. And that was his position that Dovid Hamelech gave him. And the Barban also points out that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was given this position, and he would attend the king, and he would do whatever the king commanded him to do. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, one of his positions was to be near the king and to do whatever the king commanded of him. He was that person who Dovid Hamelech kept handy to always have nearby to help him out. Now, the system Dovid Hamelech employed in his military to keep it very organized is mentioned in chapter 23 of Shmuel Beis. And it's a massive dispute about how to organize the 37-member military leadership of Dovid Hamelech's warrior generals. The Targum Yonasan, Rashi, Ralbag, Radak, Abarbanel, Metzudas David, the Malbim, and many others all try to reorganize this 37-member military leadership into different categories and different buckets. And there's a very, very interesting conversation, which is far beyond the scope of this class. That being said, we're going to pick one, which we'll pick the Abarbanel. And the Abarbanel organizes the 37 military leadership in such a way. The commander of the army of Dovid Hamelech was Yoav ben Tzruya. The top 3 officers, the bodyguards of Dovid Hamelech, was Adinoi Ha'etzni, Elazar ben Doidoi, and Shama ben Agay. These 3 men that fought single-handedly with Dovid Hamelech, saving the farms from the Plishti warriors. Later on, they stayed loyal to Dovid Hamelech, and they remained his bodyguards and his top-level officers throughout the reign of Dovid Hamelech. Now, the 3 officers of the chiefs, and these are also the same men, according to the Barbanel, who drew the water, which means Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah is in that group. The 3 officers of the 30 chiefs, also known as the 3 men who drew water, is Avishai ben Tzruya, Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, and an unknown 3rd member, and the Barbanel suggests maybe it's Yoav ben Tzruya, maybe it's Sheva ben Gera, maybe it's Adina ben Shiza Haruveni. And then after that is 30 chiefs of the army who were under the command of Avishai, Beniyahu, and this unknown third warrior. And of course, there are many other ways of organizing it. The Metzudas and the Radak and the Ralmag have very different ways of organizing these 37 warrior chiefs who led Dovid Hamelech's very powerful army. Now, many years go by without Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's name coming up. He served Dovid Hamelech, he was in charge of the Kreisi and Pleisi, he was of based in, but then his name comes up again, and the importance of his name and deep relevance to Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah also comes up with the rebellion of Avsholom. The rebellion of Avsholom happens in the 37th year of Dovid Hamelech's reign, 3 years before Dovid Hamelech passes away. And although Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's name isn't mentioned much throughout the rebellion of Avsholom, the ramifications of the rebellion have direct connection to the story of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. Now, in this series, we're not going to mention great length all the details of the rebellion. There's much more information about Avsholom's rebellion in the 3-part series of the story of Achitophel. But here's the general overview of the story. In the 37th year of Dovid Hamelech's reign, his son Avsholom rebels. And Avsholom gathered incredible amount of support. He was assisted by Dovid Hamelech's closest friend and closest advisor, Achitophel. Achitophel was a brilliant man who up to that point had at least been feigning loyalty to Dovid Hamelech. And he was a great assistance to Avsholom's rebellion. And Dovid Hamelech genuinely feared the influence of Achitophel and the power of Achitophel. Additionally, Dovid Hamelech had a nephew, Ammasa, who also joined the rebellion against Dovid Hamelech. This Ammasa was the son of Yisra HaYisraeli and his sister Abigail. His sister Abigail had a son called Ammasa, so it was Dovid Hamelech's nephew, and this Ammasa joined the enemy, joined Dovid Hamelech's son against Dovid Hamelech. Avsholom got tremendous support, and Achitophel did his best to manipulate Avsholom, not just to rebel to be the heir to the throne, but to rebel to actually kill Dovid Hamelech. Dovid Hamelech understood this, and Dovid Hamelech fled. He escaped the city of Yerushalayim together with his loyal supporters, and among the loyal supporters, many of them are listed. Yoav ben Tzruya, the general of his army, was loyal to Dovid Hamelech. The Kohen Gadol Eviasar and his son Yehonasan was loyal. Tzadok and his son Achimaatz, who were 2 Kohanim, were both loyal to Dovid Hamelech. Hushai Ha'arki, who Dovid Hamelech sent back as a spy, but he was loyal to Dovid Hamelech. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah is not mentioned by name, but his elite unit, the Kreisi and the Pleisi, are specifically mentioned as being loyal to Dovid Hamelech and joining Dovid Hamelech as he escaped Yerushalayim. Now, as Dovid Hamelech left, Dovid Hamelech wanted to find out from Hashem what to do. So he calls the high priest, he calls Eviasar, the Kohen Gadol, and he asks Eviasar to ask of Hashem through the Urim, the Tumim, through the breastplate that the high priest wore. He said, I have a question from God, could you ask God on my behalf? Until that point, Eviasar had managed to give an answer from Hashem through the breastplate that he wore, but this time there was no answer. And Dovid Hamelech was very puzzled. And Dovid Hamelech called another Kohen, Tzadok, and told Tzadok the Kohen, I want you to ask Hashem. And Hashem gave an answer through Tzadok. And Dovid Hamelech understood, and very important for our story, Dovid Hamelech understood at this point that the high priesthood was going to leave the family of Eviasar, who incidentally was a descendant of Eli HaKohen, and was going to now go back to the family of Tzadok, who was a descendant of Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron HaKohen. Dovid Hamelech understood that this was a pivotal moment. That prophecy that had been told by Dovid Hamelech's teacher, Shmuel HaNavi, that the family of Eli would lose the high priesthood, he understood that this very moment, as he was leaving Yerushalayim, escaping his son trying to murder him, he understood that the family of the high priesthood was leaving Eviasar and was going to Tzadok. A very important moment in history. Dovid Hamelech continued to travel north, and he arrives in the city of Bichri, which is in the territory of Binyamin. And as he's arriving there, as he's approaching the city, a relative of King Shaul, whose name was Shimi ben Gera, comes out and begins hurling insults towards Dovid Hamelech. And while he's hurling insults, he's hurling stones as well towards David and to all his men. And Shimon ben Gera's words were deeply, deeply insulting, but the meaning behind the words were even worse. Later on in this episode, we're going to discuss Shimon ben Gera's story at much greater length and talk about how King Shlomo and Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah together succeeded in punishing Shimon ben Gera. But this was one of the big moments that happened when Dovid Hamelech was escaping for his life from Avsholom. Dovid Hamelech crossed over the Jordan River into the eastern side of the land of Israel, the 2.5 tribes, and Dovid Hamelech remained on the other side of the Jordan until the end of the civil war. Achitophel tried to convince Avsholom to go to an instant battle with Dovid Hamelech. Hushai Ha'arki succeeded in convincing Avsholom to create a drawn-out, massive war instead. And when Achitophel saw that his advice was rejected, Achitophel went home and committed suicide. And to learn more about that shocking story, listen to the series on Achitophel. A massive battle did end up taking place, a civil war in the forest of Ephraim between Dovid Hamelech's forces and Avsholom's forces. And even though Avsholom had so much support, Dovid Hamelech and Yoav thoroughly crushed Avsholom's side. And then, although Dovid Hamelech had insisted to Yoav, do not kill my son, Yoav ben Zeruiah put 3 spears in Avsholom's heart, killing him and ending the battle. He then blew on the shofar and the battle was over. And then after the battle, Yoav additionally rebukes Dovid Hamelech for mourning for his son and for the way that he treated his supporters. And Dovid Hamelech was very upset with Yoav. And so Dovid Hamelech replaces Yoav as his general. And he replaces him with Ammasa, who had been loyal to Avsholom during the rebellion. So he replaces one of his nephews, Yoav, who had been loyal to him during the rebellion, with Ammasa, who had gone over to the enemy's side. But now Dovid Hamelech sends a message to Ammasa. He had survived the battle, and he tells a message to the Kohanim to tell his nephew Ammasa. And to Ammasa say this: "You are my own flesh and blood. May Hashem do thus and more to me if you do not become an army commander permanently in place of Yoav." Now, this reconciliation with Ammasa helped create peace after the civil war. So it was a tremendous moment. And also, what's interesting is, after Achitophel's death, Dovid Hamelech replaces Achitophel with Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah and Avyasa as now his official advisors. So he needed to replace his advisors, and so Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah was one of the people who took over that position. Now, shortly after the war, right after the civil war finished, a man by the name of Sheva ben Bichri decided to stage a rebellion against Dovid Hamelech as well. Sheva ben Bichri was a lawless man from the tribe of Binyamin, and he sounded the shofar and he made an announcement. He said, "We have no portion in David, no share in Yishai's son. Back to your homes, O Yisrael." The Zohar says his intention was to gather everyone for idol worship. He was a dreadful man, and he saw the void after the civil war, and he took advantage of it. And he gathered also a massive support among the Jewish people. Dovid Hamelech wanted to very quickly assassinate him, very quickly kill Sheva ben Bichri to put the rebellion down as quick as possible. And so Dovid Hamelech orders his new general, his nephew Ammasa, and purposely didn't call Yoav, to gather the warriors of Yehuda and tell them to come in front of Dovid Hamelech in 3 days so they could chase after Sheva ben Bichri and kill him and stop the rebellion. So Gemara in Sanhedrin explains that Ammasa went to go gather the men. And when he arrived, he saw that they were all starting a new section in Torah. And so Ammasa thought to himself, it's going to be very disruptive for their Torah learning if I take them out right now, straight away, straight out to battle. The Gemara explains that Ammasa learned from Yehoshua, Joshua, many hundreds of years earlier, that one is permitted to disobey a king when it comes to matters of minimizing the learning of Torah. So Ammasa said to himself, Dovid Hamelech is giving me an instruction that he doesn't know is going to be very disruptive to Torah learning. Because it's the king versus Torah learning, I'm allowed to disobey the king. And so Ammasa waited a few days in order to not disrupt the Torah learning. Dovid Hamelech, meanwhile, doesn't see his nephew Ammasa showing up, and he needs to urgently quash this rebellion. So Dovid Hamelech calls another one of his nephews, Avishai ben Seruya, who's Yoav's brother, but again, not Yoav himself, and tells him, take my men, take my soldiers, and pursue after Sheva ben Bichri, kill him. And the Metzudas David explained that Dovid Hamelech still didn't want to call Yoav because he was so angry at him for killing Avsholom. So Avishai now sets off with Dovid Hamelech's men, followed by Yoav and the Kreisi and the Pleisi. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's men are there as well. And as they're heading towards where Sheva ben Bichri's last been spotted, they happen upon Ammasa, who's now heading towards Dovid Hamelech with all the men. Finally, he's gathered them. Now, Yoav saw this. Yoav saw the new general, and either he held that Ammasa was a traitor because he had disobeyed the king. The king had given an instruction to hurry and get the men, and Ammasa had taken so long, or he was so upset to see Avsholom's general now leading Dovid Hamelech's men. And Yoav calls out to Ammasa, how are you, brother? They were cousins. And with Yoav's right hand, he grabs hold of Ammasa's beard as if to kiss him. So Ammasa wasn't on guard. And then Yoav took his sword and thrust it right through his belly, and his entire entrails fell onto the ground, and he died. Yoav killed Dovid Hamelech's new pick for general. Yoav then told the men to continue marching. They had orders from the king, and they marched and they chased Sheva ben Bichri to the city of Ovel. Yoav then has a big discussion with an elderly woman who was in the city, who was trying to not get the entire city killed. Her name was Serach bas Osher. She was actually the granddaughter of Yaakov Avinu. She had been blessed with long life because she was the one that told Yaakov that Yosef was still alive. At this point, based on my calculations, she would have been at least 683 years old. But she has a discussion with Yoav and convinces Yoav, do not go to war against the entire city. We'll bring you the body of Sheva ben Bichri, but don't go to war. And Yoav agreed. And he told his men, don't attack the city, let's wait. And a short while later, a severed head of Sheva ben Bichri was thrown over the wall, and the rebellion finished, and the entire city was saved, thanks to Serach bas Osher's brilliant negotiations. The Malbim explains that after this war, Dovid Hamelech desperately wanted to appoint Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah as the general of the Jewish people. But after the story of Sheva ben Bichri, when he saw how much he needed Yoav, and he also saw how much national support Yoav had, Dovid Hamelech realized that he needed to place Yoav back in the position. His nephew Ammasa had been murdered, and Dovid Hamelech was very upset about it, but at the same time, he placed Yoav back in the position of general. And what's really interesting, it's going to have incredible ramifications at the end of the story, there's a Rashi, and the Rashi says that at this point, Yoav places all his friends in positions of power in Dovid Hamelech's army. And one of the positions is Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, which makes it very clear that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah and Yoav were very, very close. They were very good friends. At the end of the book of Shmuel, when discussing the personal three bodyguards and honored warriors and the three warrior chiefs in Dovid Hamelech's army, Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah is mentioned alongside them, and also a list of incredible feats that he managed to accomplish. In fact, Beniyahu gets more descriptions and verses of his feat than even the three personal bodyguards of Dovid Hamelech who outranked him in the army. The verses are very famous. We're only going to touch upon it slightly, just to give you a little bit of an understanding, but there's so much information on these verses. The verse says, and Beniyahu, the son of Yehoyadah, Ben Ishchai, or Ben Ishchayel, which means the son of a warrior, a mighty man of deeds from Kafsoel, he struck down the two Moabite great men, and he went down and struck the lion in the well on that snowy day. The next verse, he struck the Egyptian man, a man of frightening countenance, and there was a spear in the Egyptian's hand. He went down to him with a stick and stole the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These verses are also repeated again in the book of Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, but there are some differences between the Egyptian who Beniyahu fought against, and we'll talk about that. So the three acts of physical strength that he did is, number one, he struck the two Ariel Moav. We'll explain the different opinions. Also, he struck the lion in the well on the snowy day. And the third one is the fight against the Egyptian. So he struck Huhika Eshnei Ariel Moav. He struck the two Ariel Moav. The Targum Yonason says he struck down two great ones of Moav. The Targum Yonason keeps it vague. The Ralbag says that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah struck the two towers of Moav. That's what it means. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah struck down the fierce men of two towers in Moav, and the Ralbag suggests that perhaps these men had the image of a lion on their clothing, and he says also Ari Kel means a strong lion, and so that's the Ralbag's opinion, and many other bring that down as well. And the Abarbanel says he struck down two men of Moav who were lion-like in strength, and then the Abarbanel also brings down the Ralbag's opinion. Now, what does it mean he went down and struck the lion in the well on the snowy day? The Radak says, we're told that it's a snowy day because lions on cold and snowy days will have added strength. And the Radak also mentions the opinion of the Gemara that these verses are not about physical strength, but rather about spiritual strength. But then the Radak says, no, we need to keep according to the Peshat, we need to keep according to the simple explanation, and this is talking about Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's physical strength. The Ralbag says, we see three things from the fact that he fought a lion in a well on a snowy day. Number one, it was a snowy day. It indicates Beniyahu's strength. This is a time when he'd be so much more weaker. It's cold and snowy, and he was still able to fight. Number two, he was in a pit. A pit is a place that's even more cold, and there's a stronger chill in a pit, and he still was able to fight. And number three, neither him or the lion had any way to escape. He was deep in a pit, and so one of them had to destroy each other. Ralbag says, nevertheless, Beniyahu, the son of Yehoyadah, the Kohen Gadol, descended. He was not afraid that the lion would harm him, and he went down in there and he struck the lion because of his great strength. The Abarbanel says also three things. Beniyahu fought the strongest of the animals, the lion. Because it was in a well, Beniyahu could distance himself away from the lion, and the tight quarters made it much more dangerous for him than for the lion. And number three, because it was a snowy day, Beniyahu's hands and feet were intensely cold, and he was unable to fight with his full strength because of the overpowering cold. The Metzudas Dovid, he says it was a tight spot, so much harder to dominate a lion in close quarters, and also it's the nature of lions to fight harder during the cold, and Beniyahu still managed to succeed in killing the lion. The Malbim adds one little detail and says the well was where the lion lived. So Beniyahu went down to the lair of the lion, where the lion was most comfortable, and still managed to defeat it over there. And the third big event of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah in the verses is he struck the Egyptian man, v'hu hika es ish Mitzri, ish mare, a man of countenance, uv'yad ha-Mitzri chanis, and in the hand of the Egyptian was a spear, vayered elov bashavet, and Beniyahu went down only with a stick. Vayigzol es hachanes, and he stole the spear, miyad ha-Mitzri, from the Egyptian's hand, vayahargehu bechanisai, and then killed the Egyptian with the Egyptian spear that he had stolen. Now, in Divrei Hayamim, it's mentioned a little bit different, and we have a few extra details that aren't mentioned in the book of Shmuel. The Egyptian is described as 5 amas tall, which, again, depending on today's measurements, is either between 7.5 feet tall or 9 feet tall. This Egyptian was a very, very large man. Additionally, when describing the spear, it says the spear was like a weaver's beam, kiminur ergim, which the Metzudas David says the handle was like the beam of a weaver. The handle is the part where the person's grip goes on, which means that if a person has to hold a spear that has a handle that's the size of a weaver's beam, it's tremendously, tremendously large. And he would be a tremendously large person to be able to grip his hands around it. It's actually the same description as a spear of Goliath, Kiminur Ergim. Tremendously thick. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah managed to grab that off him and also managed to use it as a weapon to kill that man. There's a famous Gemara in Baba Kama. And the Gemara in Baba Kama is trying to establish what's the difference between a ganov, a thief, and a gazlan, a robber, in regards to paying penalties, in regard to 4 and 5, and stealing sheep, etc. There are big halachic ramifications when it comes to establishing the difference between a thief and a robber. So the Gemara says a thief, a ganov, is someone who sneaks into the house. But a gazlan, a robber, is someone that steals in public without hiding and with force. And the Gemara says, if you want an example of that, look at Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. He grabs his enemy's own weapon in public and then kills him with it. In fact, the Rambam uses the Gemara's example of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah as well when trying to establish what's the difference between a gazlan, a robber. They say that's the type of behavior a robber is going to do. Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah did it for the good. He was defending the Jewish people against a man who hated the Jewish people. But if you want to understand the mentality of what a gazlan looks like, what a robber looks like, a robber is someone with a public, forceful approach. The Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin also has a discussion about what is a gazlan, and the Yerushalmi says a gazlan is someone who steals in front of his owner, like we see Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah did in this very verse. Rabbi Abahu in the Yerushalmi actually adds on. He says a gazlan needs to do it the same way that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah killed the Egyptian, which means that a gazlan needs to steal in front of 10 people to be counted as an official robber, as an official halachic gazlan. You need to do it in front of 10 people, because that's how Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah did it, and a robber needs to copy his behavior exactly. Now, there are many that learn these 3 verses as not just being physical expressions of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's greatness at war, at military, but rather it's a description of his spiritual strength, of his righteousness, and his Torah strength. His description, Ben Ish Chayil, or Ben Ish Chai, means a son of a living man. The Gemara very famously asks, does that mean that everyone else is the children of dead? He's described as Ben Ish Chai, the son of a living man. That means everyone else is dead? And the Gemara says no. Ben Ish Chai, about Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, means that even after he passes away, his righteousness is so great that after he passes away, he's still considered living. And this becomes a status throughout Chazal, throughout Torah. We have this idea that tzaddikim are still considered alive even after their passing. And where is the source of this? From Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. He's described as Ben Ish Chai. The Gemara says that he's alive after his passing. And throughout Chazal, everywhere, you see this expression coming over and over and over. In fact, there's a famous Rashi where Rashi uses it in the opposite extreme. Rashi says regarding the passing of Avram's father Terach, and contrasts it to Beniyahu, and says that Terach, because he was wicked, was considered like he was already dead during his lifetime, but Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, after his passing, was still considered like he was alive. And we mentioned the Ralbag earlier that says the Ben Ish Chai is a praise not just to Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah, but also a praise to his father, that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's superiority and strength came from his father. Now his description as Rav Pa'olim Mikavtsoel, that he did wondrous things and he came from the city of Kavtsoel, the Gemara explains Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah accumulated and gathered many workers for the sake of Torah. That's what the verse really is talking about. And the famous commentator, Rav Yosef Chaim ben Eliyahu from Baghdad, who has a pirush called Ben Yehoyadah, inspired after this great tzaddik, he explains like this: the Gemara is telling us that the quality of people that Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah gathered to Torah were not just people who explain the Torah well, but scholars who explain Torah successfully and fulfill it successfully. Rav Pa'olim, they were incredible at actually fulfilling the Torah. And one more explanation on the spiritual explanations of Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah. And he descended and slew the lion in the pit on the snowy day. The Gemara in Brachas brings 2 opinions for this. One opinion is he broke blocks of hail, of ice, and descended to go to mikvah, to immerse himself. And others say he was such an accomplished scholar that he could learn through the entire Sifra, which is the halachic medrash on the book of Vayikra. It's considered the hardest of the hardest Torah. He was able to learn all this on a winter's day. This is how accomplished he was at learning Torah. In the upcoming podcast, we're going to talk about Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah's tremendously important role in the transfer of the throne from Dovid Hamelech and all the people that tried to stop it, and how Beniyahu Ben Yehoyadah managed to defend King David and King Shlomo.
Thank you for listening to Untold Stories of the Torah. If you enjoyed this episode, help us spread the word by subscribing to this channel and leaving us a review.